This is The Origins of Humankind by On Humans and Carta, produced and hosted by me, Ilari Mäkelä. It's an exciting moment. It's the first episode in this 5-part series, exploring one of the greatest stories ever told, the story of how we became the creatures that we are today. And to get this story started, I could not imagine a better guest than Tim Coulson. Coulson is the head of the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford. I never actually got to interact with him during my own time in Oxford 10 or so years ago, despite us sharing the same building. But recently, he published a book called Universal History of Us, a book which, with remarkable success, I think, integrates all the basic science that we know today that can explain why we exist. The book starts with the Big Bang. We're going to take a little bit more humble of an approach today, focusing on life and how we humans fit within the greater story of life on Earth. We start by questions such as, what is life? How did it get started? Talk about why animals and plants evolved, about what our ancestors were like during the time of the dinosaurs, and about how a climate change opened the doors for the rise and the spread of humans. And spoiler alert, this is very much an episode about evolution. This is not an episode about holy books, despite all my respect for them. Nevertheless, apples and snakes will play a part, so stay tuned. If you enjoy this conversation, definitely subscribe to On Humans if you haven't done so yet, and do share this forward to someone who might enjoy it too. You can also head to onhumans.substack.com/origins to get more material, written highlights from this and future episodes, videos, and future essays that I publish on this and related topics. So that's again onhumans.substack.com/origins. And finally, before we get started, I just want to say a couple of thank you notes. First of all, to the wonderful people at UC San Diego, at the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny, so CARTA for short. Their program manager, Jesse Robbie, reached out to me a little bit less than a year ago, suggesting we should do something together, and we worked hard with Jesse and with Professor Pascal Gagneux, the co-director of CARTA, to make something happen, and well, here is something. Do check out, by the way, CARTA's other material. They have a ton of free-for-all stuff on human origins on the web. You'll find links to that also at onhumans.substack.com/origins. I also want to say a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. Wouldn't have been possible to do this without all of your support. So thank you so much. And this series is for you. So let's get the show started with Oxford professor and the author of The Universal History of Us, Tim Coulson. Professor Tim Coulson, welcome to On Humans.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You've written a pretty impressive, sweeping account of natural history. It's called The Universal History of Us. Why don't we start by you tell the story. What led you into writing this kind of a book?
Yeah, so it's quite a long story. It stretches over quite a long period of my life. So when I was in my early 20s, I was working in Kenya, and then I hitchhiked down through Tanzania and Malawi, and this would have been in 1989, so many moons ago. And I had two types of tablets with me. I had anti-malarial, and I also had water purification tablets, and I was an idiot, and I muddled them up. Every time I thought I was taking my anti-malarials, I was swallowing raw chlorine and ended up with a terrible stomachache. And every time I was drinking water from a stream or from somewhere I wasn't sure whether it was going to be clean, I was dissolving my anti-malarials in it, which of course did no good. So I got sick. I got some stomach bug that laid me up for a week or so and couldn't, keep any food down. And during that time, I got bitten by a mosquito that was infected with malaria, and I developed malaria.
Okay, that's quite a cocktail of problems.
I know. Anyway, I got back to the UK. It was towards the end of my trip, and I got rushed into hospital. And the doctors, once they diagnosed it and treated me, they said, well, the next attack would have probably killed you. And so I thought, well, life's pretty good fun. I've been swanning around Africa, but I really should have some aim, some objective in my life. And I decided, because I'd kind of decided that religion wasn't for me, I decided that by the time I lie on my eventual deathbed, I'd like to understand what science could tell us about why we existed, why we exist, why we were here. And so I started reading very widely, and really enjoyed it. I was reading physics, I was reading chemistry, I was reading biology, really enjoying it. And then didn't really think, just kept on working and taking notes and thinking about it. And then when I was in my 30s, I told some people I was doing this, some friends, this is what I wanted to do. And one of them said, you should write a book. So I then thought, that's a good idea. So I started telling people I was writing a book. And it became a bit of a joke because, of course, I didn't really make very much progress until the pandemic. And my wife and I spent a year in Australia during the pandemic. And I thought, well, if I don't write this book now, I'm never going to write it. So I wrote the book. And then I thought, what am I going to do with this book? I mean, it's a history of the universe. It's called The Universal History of Us, as you said. In the US, it's called The Science of Why We Exist. It's a different publisher. And so I wrote the book and didn't know what to do with it. I got very lucky. I got a wonderful literary agent called Rebecca Carter, and she sold advance rights to Penguin, Michael Joseph, and they published it. And now people are reading it, it seems. I recorded the audiobook version, and I'm asked to do exciting podcasts like this.
So happy ever after, yes. So well, let's start. I mean, the story of life is what, over 3 billion years. So again, we're gonna have to squeeze quite a lot in. I thought one way we could do this is that I'm working on a book for young readers, which touches upon similar topics, and so I've thought a lot about how to talk about kind of key moments in mostly human history, but also natural history, in a way that even a 12-year-old can understand this. And so I thought that maybe we can have a kind of I can try my best to summarize some of the key moments from the story, and you, as a professor of biology at the University of Oxford and the author of the Universal History of Us, can then correct me in every way with every mistake I make and compliment or comment, and that way I get to train my skills, and the audience can hear you rip my attempts apart and hopefully learn something in the process. So shall we do that?
Well, let's go for it. But before we start, good luck with your writing, and great to hear you're writing a book. It sounds very exciting. I'll look forward to that coming out in due course.
Yeah, I actually have quite a lot of the natural history stuff is ready. I can send you something to take a look if you want. It's been great fun.
Brilliant.
Yeah, but thank you. But yeah, let's begin. I mean, the beginning, I would say we should probably find a way to talk about the what is life. I mean, if we think about the origin of life, what does it mean? How would this serve as a kind of starting point? That life is something that maintains itself. It's some kind of a thing that isn't just a rock that is stably there, nor is it like a gas that kind of evaporates everywhere. It's something that constantly remakes itself. It has self-maintenance. And what's really important is that this self-maintenance will eventually break apart. There will be death. But then there is a wonderful thing, which is that life tricks death, not by living forever, but by creating copies of itself, by replicating. And immediately, if we see things that are kind of self-maintaining, and before they die, somehow being able to copy themselves, we could call that thing alive. How is that as a starting point?
I think that's not bad at all. I think that's good. So I think I would define it as sort of naturally occurring. So I think that's something we need to say, or naturally arising. I think you're right. Replication, making copies of yourself, is a key word. All of life that we know is based on cells. So I think having it surrounded by a cell membrane is kind of an important part as well, that perhaps you didn't touch upon there. And I think that's really important when we think about how life got started. And then of course, the other bit, and you hinted at this, is it requires an energy source. So there's some external energy source. And for us, it's food. For plants, it's light in terms of photosynthesis. But yeah, no, I think your definition is a good one.
And the energy source, I guess, it fits into the picture because you can't keep maintaining anything and you can't keep copying anything if you don't have some energy to make those things happen, right?
That's right. You drive the replication through an energy source.
Now that we are on the definition of life, I know that one of the kind of often seen as one of the great unsolved puzzles of science is the origin of life. So now that we have the idea of what we're trying to explain, Without going too much into the details of, the RNA world and what a catalytic sets or whatnot, what will be your kind of quick pitch? How and where did life start?
So I think life is made from building blocks, and those building blocks are organic molecules that somehow came together into the first types of cells, the first protocells. And so I think one of the first questions is, where did the building blocks of life come from? And interestingly, many of those building blocks of life are made in space. So they, when we look at meteorites that have crashed to Earth, things like the Murchison meteorite is a great example. It's covered and throughout it, there are lots of organic molecules that life uses. So many of the building blocks of life, including water, believe it or not, which is not carbon-based, obviously, but water arrived on Earth from meteorites and space dust.
Really?
Yeah. So if you look at the Murchison meteorite, it contains amino acids. It contains the building blocks of nuclear bases of DNA. It contains phosphates. So phospholipids are key for cell membranes. So certainly many of the building blocks of life don't have to have been made on Earth. They could be made in space. And back then, when the Earth was very young, sort of, around 4 billion years ago, there was a lot more collisions of rocks in the solar system and Earth. The moon had recently formed from a collision.
Is there an easy explanation for why there were more?
Just because when planets form, through the force of gravity, they'll sort of suck up as they go around lots of debris.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're kind of vacuuming the
Exactly. They're kind of vacuuming up what's
Yeah.
there. So our guess is that the building blocks of life are really reasonably quite common. They then arrived on Earth, and the next step is they needed to accumulate into a sort of reasonably high concentration. And the reason for that is, life is run on lots of, of millions of ongoing reactions. And if your molecules are too spread out, life is not going to be able to get going. And so the question is, how did life accumulate? How did the molecules accumulate? Because when the first, just sort of taking a sideways step, if we think about life now and you think about what goes on inside your cells and what goes on inside my cells, the chemistry that's happening there is a lot more complicated than the chemistry that happens in the environment around us, on the computer screen, on the table, in the air around us. It's very, very different. But when life started, that couldn't have been the case. It must have arisen from an environment where there was lots of these molecules interacting.
Yes, so the boundary between life and non-life must have been much less pronounced in the very beginning. And in a sense, of course, there must have been a time without there being such a boundary.
That's exactly right. So you need to concentrate your organic molecules in order to get life started. And also you need an energy source in those locations where those molecules become concentrated. And so there's two arguments that have been made as to where life could have got going. Both involve volcanoes or volcanic activity. One of them is that life got started in hydrothermal vents in the ocean. And a lot of volcanic, highly reactive molecules, hydrogen sulfides and what have you, are bubbling through. And early life would have been able to use those highly reactive molecules in order to power some of the reactions that were necessary for early life. And it's possible that concentrations of the molecules that life used were able to accumulate in tiny little sort of cell-like structures that form naturally, crystalline structures that form naturally around these hydrothermal vents. The other argument is they form on hydrothermal plains. So those are freshwater, those are places on land where volcanic activity touches the surface of the land where there's fresh water. And so places like Yellowstone and Iceland, where you get a lot of thermal volcanic activity, are good places. So those are the two arguments where the concentrations occurred.
Okay, so in the waters, and interestingly fed by space.
Yeah.
Fed by space rocks. Yeah. Bringing in, that's a wonderful image of this kind of early Earth where ingredients are being spit in from the outside and okay, and then they get going in the waters. Is there anything else we should say before we move to the next step?
So there are some chemical reactions where a molecule is able to replicate itself. Now, you said you don't want to get into autocatalytic reactions, but that's what they are. And so the first life would have been a relatively simple autocatalytic reaction, and it would have been attached to something called the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, which all life runs on now. And we don't fully understand exactly how everything got going, but it did, and it got going really quite quickly. So this is another reason why people argue that simple life might be quite common, because life, the moon was formed in a massive collision with the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. It melted the Earth's surface. It would have destroyed any organic molecules that had formed on Earth. Earth had to be reseeded. The earliest life really could have got going would probably be about 4.2 billion years ago. It was probably a little bit later. But we know that by 4 billion years ago, it was up and running. And by 3.9 billion years ago, all life was using the same genetic code. And that's the genetic code that we use now. So simple life got going actually really surprisingly quickly, which gives hope that life may start on other planets, particularly given the building blocks are made in space, right? So, yeah.
So the aliens might very well be there.
Certainly simple life may be quite common. We don't know, but that's a hypothesis, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, well, actually, you already touched upon what I thought of the second section on this story, which is the origins of DNA, and I guess the hero in this journey is going to be Luca, the last universal common ancestor. Now, basically, let me try my simplification, and then you can do the same as you did earlier, which is elaborate and correct. So life, as we discussed, replicates. It creates copies of itself. In the beginning, we don't really know how they did it, but the codes had to be written somewhere, and the first codes were probably quite weak in a sense that they were easy to break apart. But at some point, a kind of ingenious system is created where you can have a very stable structure where these instructions for the copying and maintenance of life were written. This is, of course, the double helix structure of DNA, like a twisted ladder. And very soon after this invention had been done, there was one creature alive who used this in the same way as all cells nowadays do. This is the famous Luca from Last Universal Common Ancestor. And yeah, so maybe, I don't know if Luca deserves the greatest inventor of all time prize, or if there were many DNA-based cells going around and it happened to be that Luca survived, so that would be the greatest ever survivor story, I guess. But yeah, then we already have cells living with replicating and maintaining themselves using the same language, same code as we use still today.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. And I think Luca, there's certainly the genetic code that Luca used is the great survivor. That's absolutely right. Luca no longer exists, but the code that it uses did.
Yeah.
And there probably were alternative codes out there, and evolution weeded them out. And Luca had the magic, right? Luca had the magic.
Do you think they were different? I mean, I'm very convinced that there were other genetic codes, but do you think there were other DNA, double helix structured DNAs that were just a tiny bit different, or could it have been that it was really the creation, that basically the creation, the invention of DNA as we think about it, and Luca were basically the same event?
It's a good question, and we don't know the answer to that, and I think it's probably going to be very difficult to find evidence that allows us to answer that. My suspicion is that once DNA formed, there would have been different. DNA is a remarkable molecule because it's very stable, as you pointed out. It doesn't react with anything, yet it contains self-assembly manuals for organisms, how to build a body, how to build a cell, how to build you, how to build me. That's what DNA does. But there could be many different codes, and there could have been different amino acids that we use. So my suspicion is that once DNA had evolved, there probably were a set of different codes, but the one that life settled on was the one that outcompeted the others. And we don't know why. We don't know what the advantage would be, but yeah.
And I guess whether Luca was the only one using DNA or as you hinted, probably not the only one. Luca is the only one who did manage to trick death until this day by replicating and its descendants replicating. what DNA allowed, I guess, would it be as simple as saying that what DNA compared to whatever weaker RNA or something else that probably were used before, what it allowed was just more complicated codes, more complicated and more stable mechanisms, allowing therefore more complicated, I guess, creatures to evolve, or is that too much of a simplification of what DNA is?
The stability of DNA, I think, is important. And the fact that it can form very long chains is also absolutely important. The fact that it's not copied perfectly and mutations occurred is important and is crucial for life. And obviously, it's not just DNA, it's the structure of how the DNA code is turned into proteins, and proteins are the workhorses of life. And that's quite complicated chemistry that involves various steps along the way. It's done more simply in bacteria than it is in eukaryotes. So we're all eukaryotes, so animals and plants. But once that had evolved, I think then DNA, life was able to explore all sorts of ways of working, producing all sorts of proteins. Many were dead ends, but every now and again there's a beneficial mutation where a more efficient protein or a new protein is formed. Life finds a way of doing it. And I mean, life has had 3.9 billion years to sort of dream up the life forms that we see on Earth today. And I think one of the things that we often really struggle with is actually understanding quite what a vast tract of time that is. 3 billion. It's nearly impossible for us to envisage 3.9 billion years. It's hard enough to envisage, anything more than about 100 years, to be honest, which is
Yes,
a long
yes,
lifespan. So even when we're going back to the evolution of primates and the evolution of first great apes and what have you, when we're still talking tens of millions of years, it's still a vast time track. And I think that's one of the things that's hard for us to understand and hard for us to get our head around, is quite how long life has had. And that for most of that time, a lot of that time, it was still pretty simple. It was still single cells. It's only about 2 billion years ago, perhaps, where the first eukaryote, the complex cells, arrived and the first multicellular organisms started to come into existence. So it's
yeah.
had an awfully long time to explore sort of phenotypic space, as it were. And
Yeah. Well, and I guess they're hinted already many times at eukaryotes and multicellular life. I mean, in a sense, it's a story of teamwork. In that first use, you have the eukaryotes are a combination of two simple cells, one kind of engulfed by the other, and then you start having multicellular life, where these cells, these eukaryotic cells, start forming teams. I guess there's a kind of interim stage where, for example, if you have bacteria filaments, you would have. It's kind of a team. It's they're kind of living together, but first of all, they're not eukaryotes, and secondly, the teams don't have clear roles where you do this and you do that and I do this, and it's once you start having this kind of genuine teams of cells, we can start speaking about them as an organism that is made up of many cells, which is obviously the most familiar thing that for you, me, and everyone else, because we are such a giant's build of teams of cells. When do you start having do we know when we have the first multicellular organisms, cell teams?
Yeah, so there are what people call waiting times. And so it's how long do you have to wait for a particular innovation to occur, an evolutionary innovation to occur. And so those waiting times, we've already talked about the first one, which is, say, the first life is approximately 4 billion years ago. The genetic code had evolved about 100 million years later, by 3.9 billion years ago. The first eukaryote, sorry, I think I was about 2.7 billion years ago, was when the first eukaryote evolved. And you're absolutely right. The first eukaryote, they're large. Eukaryotes are large cells compared to bacteria and archaea, so the other type of common single-celled organisms. And the first eukaryotes would have been individual cells. So yeast, for example, is a modern-day single-cell eukaryote. The first multicellular organisms would have occurred about 2 billion years ago. So you had over 500 million years where eukaryotes had existed. However, in order for multicellular organisms to evolve and to certainly to thrive, you needed buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere. And the sort of buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere was kind of a gradual process. It involved various steps. It was about 2.5 billion years ago when you really started to see significant increases.
Yeah, and I mean, you did mention that it's gradual, and I think it's funny in geology and this kind of really deep look into life. You often hear about an event, and then if you really read the event takes millions of years. And this is one of those cases, the great oxidation event?
Yeah, so the great oxygenation
oxygenation event, yes, of course, yes. Which I had heard about this before, but it had often been to me this one of these things that I was like, okay, that something happened with oxygen. Sure, okay, let's move on. So I'm happy that you're linking it to something that it's easier for me, and I guess for many listeners to understand, which is you needed to have oxygen to have these multicellular, these cell teams really build up. Why?
Well, so the way that right at the heart of all life in all cells is something called the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle can actually run in two directions. So it can run in one direction in the absence of oxygen, and it can run in another direction in the presence of oxygen.
Okay.
And once it was kind of running in the presence of oxygen, oxygen's a very highly reactive compound, and life was able to become a little bit more let me kind of take a step back. Oxygen was created by life, right? So oxygenated photosynthesis occurs when plants and blue-green algae or cyanobacteria before them and many other bacteria, they create sugars by taking water and carbon dioxide and joining them together. And one of the waste products from oxygenic photosynthesis is oxygen. And so the first global polluters were the cyanobacteria, who really evolved photosynthesis.
And they polluted the world not with carbon dioxide, with the opposite. They polluted it with oxygen.
And in fact, we don't fully understand everything about the Great Oxygenation Event in terms of how it built up. We know there's some quite complicated atmospheric chemistry that went on there as well. And it's still an area of active research. But oxygen levels did gradually build up. It meant that life was now able to use the Krebs cycle in the reverse direction. And it was able to run a little bit faster, and more complicated life forms were able to come into existence. First of all, those.
So the Krebs cycle could run faster, and in practical terms, does that mean that there's more energy, or that the change of life becomes faster? They can grow faster. I mean,
it runs more easily. Yeah, it sort of cranks round the cycle more effectively, more efficiently.
So plants, we often, when I, for example, I've taught biology to young children. And still sometimes give tutorials on it. And the typical thing, I teach, you have the animals are using the oxygen, the plants are using the carbon dioxide. So what's waste for them is wonderful for us. What's waste for us is wonderful for them. But do I get it right that what you're saying is, if we look at the Krebs cycle, if we really go into the nuts and bolts, also plants use oxygen in their Krebs cycle?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay,
that's right.
Good.
That's
So,
right.
So on the superficial level, they are very different, and they don't like oxygen. But actually, deep down, they also need this oxygen.
Oh yeah, they need oxygen to run their metabolism, but they also create it when they're building sugars.
Okay, yeah. That clarifies a lot. Wonderful. So oxygen necessary for both plants and animals, contrary to my 101 biology class. Yes, wonderful. Good. Then, is there anything else that you would want to say about this beginning? Next, I think we could already. I mean, we start seeing the emergence of plants and animals. We can move on the animal line towards vertebrates. But by the way, do we know which ones got going first, plants or animals? It would make sense for me that it was plants first, because animals tend to eat plants.
It was plants.
It was plants.
So
okay.
it was sort of seaweed-like algae type. I mean, simpler than seaweeds today, but algae. And then the first animals. So genetic work suggests the first animals appeared about 800 million years ago. The first fossils appear a little bit later than that, about 600 million years ago, but we think that it existed. The first animals were we don't know exactly what they look like, but we know that the sort of first split in the animal branch of the tree of life produced sponges that we still see today. They would have lived in reasonably deep water, probably below where light penetrated, and they evolved there. And then there were things like comb jellies. We still see them there, and all sorts of weird and wonderful life. And that appeared, that kind of the first sort of simple ecosystems to include animals appeared in the Ediacaran. But life was soft-bodied back then, and life was unable to make hard parts. And one of the reasons for it is the chemistry of the oceans wasn't right for life to be able to make hard parts.
Okay.
It couldn't make shells, it couldn't make teeth, it couldn't make bones, it couldn't make cuticles that you find on things like shrimps and insects. It was unable to do that. And the reason was the chemistry meant that the dominant mineral that formed was called something like dolomite, and life has never been able to use the mineral dolomite. But sea surface temperatures started to change towards the end of the Ediacaran. And calcium.
And when is the end of the Ediacaran?
It's just before the Cambrian, so it would have ended about 520 million
Okay,
years ago.
over 500 million years ago, and we are now knocking at the doors of the Cambrian explosion.
That's right. And one of the key things is ocean chemistry started to change. I won't go into details why, but as ocean chemistry changed, the things like calcium carbonates and silicates were available, and life can use those to make shells and hard parts and teeth. And that's important because once life could make those hard parts, and it turns out it happened again quite quickly. It was just waiting for the right environment, and it happened in lots of different animal families. So it happened independently multiple times. But once it had happened, animals could eat one another. And so predation started to take off. You need hard parts to break into another animal.
I see.
Right. So they'd eat bacteria, they'd eat single-celled stuff, but it's actually, in order to actually break into another animal, if it's two jellyfish trying to fight one another and one eat another, you might be able to eat a small one. But the first true predation events required some hard parts.
And I have heard of the expression, the Ediacaran Garden. So this is the time before predation.
There you go.
Yeah. But okay, wonderful. Now we have the hard parts. We get different families. We get some soft-bodied creatures build a hard shell around them. A lot of mollusks still today, from oysters to snails to clams. Then you have the arthropods who have the thin exoskeletons, which brings us all the insects and everything from lobsters to butterflies. And then, of course, very familiar to us, you have one hard material you can make bone.
That's right.
And you get the animals built of not only bones, but also, I guess, red blood. Doesn't that emerge pretty much with the somewhere along the vertebrate line?
Absolutely. So I don't know exactly the details of when the first red blood and hemoglobin evolved. You're right, certainly. The lines you started with the craniate, so they're organisms like hagfish were around today, and where they've got a bony skull, they don't have jaws, they're kind of suckers. And then the first jawed fish appeared, and then life really took off. And then, the plants invaded the land, followed by the insects, and then following them to eat them were the predators. So the sort of first fish, so ichthyostega and animals like that, ventured onto land.
I do often jokingly say to my students that basically you and I are land fish.
That's right.
And so are dinosaurs, so are birds, and so are snakes.
That's right. And then I think, there were our ancestors. So there's a very broad split you can make that goes back to before the Permian. And so what the Permian ended about 280 million years ago, something like that. There were two large groups of animals where both had their ancestors, way back. But you had the sauropsids and the synapsids.
Oh, I love that point, actually, from your book. I had no idea about this. So this landfish family, I guess tetrapod would be the technical term, because the four fins of the fish evolve into four limbs. And so the tetrapod family is divided into to the synapsids, out of whom only mammals are left, and
That's
the
right.
sauropsids, out of which you get dinosaurs, birds, reptiles. And by the way, what about amphibians like frogs? Are they out of
They're
this?
before, yeah. So they were before the synapsids and the sauropsids evolved. So there we branched off from the tree of life, and reptiles or early kind of reptile-like animals had evolved, and they split into the sauropsids and the synapsids. And as you said, we are synapsids. And we were dominant. Mammals, proto kind of type mammal things, synapsids, were dominant.
Yeah, so this is the point I was hinting at, which I loved in your book, because we're all familiar with the dinosaur story of there being these big dinosaurs. The big dinosaurs die out, and then the little mammals become now it's their time to roam. And something really almost like inverse kind of happened earlier, right?
That's right. So the synapsids were dominant, and the bigger animals tended to be synapsids, and the sauropsids tend to be the smaller animals. There were some big sauropsids, don't get me wrong. But in the Permian extinction, the Great Dying, it kind of flipped things around. So the synapsids, our branch of the tree of life, were lost out to the sauropsids, which went on to evolve to become dinosaurs, and they ruled the world. And then if it hadn't been for the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, dinosaurs may still be here now. They were very diverse. There were lots of species of dinosaur around when they died out. The only ones to survive were the birds. The non-avian dinosaurs all died out. The avian ones survived. And then the small mammals kind of did quite well in survival. Well, I mean, many died off, but they came to inherit the earth. And, our first ancestors, sort of had evolved sort of small tree-living, tree shrew-like animals had evolved just before the end of the Cretaceous, and they started to get a look in, and up to I can't remember, probably about they evolved into the first proto-primates, and then of course the first primates evolving start to appear about 30 million years ago, where you start to see mammals that are able to grip branches with their hands and their feet, and it's probably around that time, about 30 million years ago, where they've got a little bit bigger. They started as small, kind of squirrel or smaller sized animals. And they were still reasonably small, but they were getting a bit bigger. But what's interesting at about this point, they started to slow down. So they started to slow down their metabolism and their life history. And we know that because all primates alive today, including us, have relatively slow life histories. We're long-lived. We have a late ages at first reproduction compared to animals of a similar size.
We and humans, of course, took that slow life history, long childhoods, long age to an extreme.
We took it to the next level. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's interesting. Before, life had never seen anything like a primate before they evolved. Around 30, I can't remember, I'm going to get some of the numbers wrong, but around 30 million years ago. And I think one of the reasons it had never seen anything like that is, our ancestors and primates before them, were feeding on fruits. And fruits are from a very widespread, a dominant group of plants now called angiosperms. Now, angiosperm forests didn't come into their own until about 60 to 65 million years ago, after the Great Extinction.
So no fruit-eating dinosaurs.
They could. Well, the angiosperms probably started evolving about 135 million years ago. So there would have been a few, but the angiosperm, the giant trees, didn't really get going until the end of the Cretaceous.
Okay, and fruits become, you say, more common around somewhere after this great extinction of dinosaurs, and so is the idea that primates are basically we're specialized to be fruit eaters originally. Is that the hypothesis?
Fruit and vegetation, and this is probably one of the reasons we and our ancestors slowed down their life history.
Okay.
Because fruits are highly nutritious. There's no doubt about that, but they're also, when they're available, they're often hyper available. A fruiting tree can produce a huge amount of food, which probably brought in large numbers of individuals, which probably led to the first steps. I mean, this is speculation, but led to the first steps of social behavior in primates because they're attracted to a food source.
So a lot of proto-monkey primates, in a tree with abundant fruit, they have to figure out how to live together.
Well, and also actually not necessarily live together, but to work together to keep other individuals away from this resource. Because the resource, when it's there, there's plenty to eat. But then there are periods when, you have to survive on less nutritious food, perhaps catching insects, eating leaves, eating vegetation. And so in order to sort of, what happened is we evolved a lower metabolic rate and a slower life history, where we were able to exploit this rich source of food, fruits, when it was available, but also survive periods when it was less available. But one of the really interesting things, I think, as well, is it also suggests that our ancestors were not being preyed upon to any significant extent. And the reason for that is if you're being eaten all the time by predators, you want to speed up your life history.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes,
because you want to get through your life quickly.
Could that be just because there weren't many predators with that climbing ability? I mean, we have the first thing children often learn about primates, if they learn anything other than monkeys are primates, is that we have opposable thumbs, or if not opposable, we're very good at grasping things. Cats can't pick a telephone and throw it. We can, and so can a monkey. Last year I had my peanuts stolen by a very clever, very nimble monkey when I was I was hiking close to Mumbai, and it's almost creepy how human-like the finger work is.
That's right.
But anyway, so thinking about the role of fingers here, I mean, how much could the story be about once you become as good of a climber as these early proto-monkey, early primates were, you don't need to worry about predation that much because there aren't any predators with that climbing ability. I mean, maybe they are. Maybe there were big hawks or snakes or whatever. But when I imagine this kind of world, I can't immediately imagine who would have been the predator of a very good grasper, climber, tree mover.
So I think that's right. I think and I think that I think we could evolve a slow life history because you're right. There would have been very few predators. Birds of prey started evolving at around 40, 45 million years ago. So
I see.
There may have been other, those are modern day birds of prey. There were probably some predatory birds before. Whether they were able to prey on these primates, our ancestors, I don't know. But the slow life history suggests it wasn't a major cause of mortality. Ditto with snakes.
Maybe that's why snake fear is so deep.
It may be. And I think the threat would have been for our ancestors and these proto-primates is if they ever had to come down onto the ground, right? That's when there would have been the threat of ground-based predators. Although how many of those there would have been in forests is unclear, but I suspect that predators became important when the climate in Africa started to change, and now we're sort of talking much more recently. We've sort of jumped over, a spell when our ancestors started to come down from the trees, sort of 2 to 3 million years ago, as the trees disappeared, and then predation probably started becoming a major source of mortality for our ancestors. For example, some of the Australopithecines. Even Lucy, the famous fossil, has evidence of a bite mark on the top of one of her femurs. We don't know whether it killed her or it happened afterwards, but certainly I suspect that predation started to become a key role. The whole environment had changed, so the whole ecosystem had changed. It's around this time that big cats start to evolve. It's around this time we start to see zebras evolving.
Okay.
So I think this is important because our ancestors, when they came down from the trees and Africa was drying out, it was probably partly drying out because of the slow rise of the Isthmus of Panama.
Yes, I've actually discussed this with Ian Tattersall from the American Museum of Natural History. The very first thing we discussed when we did the kind of human story episode was the fact that when the Americas joined together, it blocked the ocean currents in a way that created a cooling and drying of the African climate, which I just was such a kind of, magical fact that we can actually know that. I mean, this is kind of the big theme of your book is you're trying to say just how much, although we don't know everything, it's incredible how much we can know about our origins. And I think for me, this is one of the mind-boggling thing we can actually detect this fact that,
No, I think it's amazing. And the Isthmus of Panama was in place by what, 2.83 million years ago. But it started forming probably sort of 15 to 20 million years ago. So it was a slow process. Plate tectonics happens slowly. And that kind of gap between North and South America and the depth of the ocean would have changed. It slowly changed ocean currents, eventually, obviously stopping water flowing through from what's now the Pacific to the Atlantic. But the ocean currents would have steadily changed. That would have contributed to global climate change, including the drying of Africa. And as Africa cooled, it was a pretty slow process where we lost trees and our ancestors were forced to the ground. They had to a more terrestrial lifestyle. And you're now an animal that's adapted to live on fruit and leaves and vegetation with a slow life history where it takes you a long time to raise your offspring. And now you're on the ground where there are things that can potentially eat you and are certainly evolving to eat you. And instead of us evolving a faster life history and kind of armor and kind of a more powerful body, we evolved. Evolution explored the area of larger brain sizes. We start to see a period of fairly significant increases in brain sizes as we start to live with predators. So I think the fact that predation becomes an issue for us, that selects for probably further group living and also larger brain sizes and, of course, tool use. And some of that tool use, I suspect, was initially for obviously breaking into nuts and grinding up vegetation, but then later starting to scavenge meat and to break into bones, and then eventually for hunting ourselves. And so we go from our ancestors went from a species that suffered very little predation, being pushed into a species that wasn't adapted to living with predators, living on the ground where predation was starting to become commonplace. It selected for us to increase brain size, and with it came more advanced tool technology. And of course, we then flip at some point where meat becomes more important in our diet, until you see things like, Homo erectus and Homo, I've forgotten what the other one's called, the other African equivalent of that, which were
Homo ergaster.
Ergaster, that's it, that's right.
Yeah. And that debate, by the way, of whether they should be called Homo erectus or Homo ergaster in Africa, I don't find particularly exciting.
Neither do I. I mean, people studying human evolution are splitters. They like and there's a good reason. If you find a new remain somewhere, argue it's a new species, you're going to publish in the pages of Nature and Science. People like to split rather than lump. But yeah, we're all Homo erectus in my
opinion. Okay, that's a hot take for today. Great.
But I think one of the key things is that the kind of sequence of humans or hominins and primates before them. First of all, we slowed our life history. We then moved down onto the ground, upright walking, bipedalism, increase in brain size. I think that there's a key sequence of when we were, we were not affected by predators and we weren't affected by predators. That then switched to then predation being a fairly significant kind of risk to our ancestors, and then through to us evolving to be predators. And I think that sequence is absolutely crucial. And if it had occurred in a different order, we might not be here today. But I think that sequence, which was driven by, the Earth and in contributions from things like the rising of the Isthmus of Panama, that sequence is actually what's made us human and has led to us, having large brains, having the ability to speak language, having dexterous hands that enable us to be able to produce tools, all of those sorts of things. I think that sequence of events is key.
and from living on that ancient fruit tree, probably together, we get a very, very long trajectory of being able to eventually live in cities, I guess, with
That's right.
with,
The first
10,000 people crammed together, or nowadays 10 million people
millions. Yeah,
crammed together.
no, exactly.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So that's that's a wonderful. I love this big picture. A couple of questions. One is about the slowing life history in primates. This is not something I've thought about before, but it just reminded me of a previous guest I've had. I don't know if you've encountered the work of Susanna Herculano Hosel. She's a neuroanatomist, but she was the first person to devise a reliable method to calculate how many neurons brains have.
Okay.
And what her work is overall quite interesting. And basically what she said is that when you look at humans, what really matters is not how big our brain is compared to an animal you pick somewhere else, but what really matters is that all primates have a very neuron dense brain.
Yeah.
And especially a brain that's really good at scaling up neurons. So when you get a big primate brain, it's just going to have a lot of neurons in the cortex. And indeed, the human neocortex has more neurons than any species. But here's the point. This is why I wanted to bring it up, was that she mentioned towards the end of our conversation that in a very recent paper, she and her collaborators, they had discovered a very strong correlation between the amount of neurons in the cortex and life history. So that the more so not the absolute brain size, not the brain size related to body ratio, but if you just look at the absolute number of neurons in the cortex, you can correlate that with how old the species can live, until when do they reach sexual maturity. And so I wonder if the slow life history could also have to do with she was clear that we don't know the link. We have no idea why it is, but if it indeed is so, that the more neurons you have in your cortex, the slower your life history is. And indeed it is true that primates have this very neuron dense brain. It seems that there could have been one event which explains something had changed, which forced or created the evolutionary conditions for primates to have this really kind of supercomputer brains, which have a lot of neurons in them. And that would also then be visible in that longer life history. So there's a couple of buts there. But first of all, I don't know if you've heard about that. It's just one paper, so I don't expect you to have encountered that paper before. But any thoughts?
I haven't read that paper, but I think it makes sense. And I think there's probably multiple drivers here. So I suspect that she's absolutely right that the number of neurons, neuron dense brain, gives you more computational ability. I think that the cortex and the neocortex certainly in primates is associated with learning and is associated with memories and being able to solve complex tasks. Now, the way that brains develop is they develop fastest when an organism is young, and then that rate of development slows as they get older. And I'm sure that's true in the cortex as well. So if you're going to grow a large brain, you almost certainly need to have a long period of childhood, a long period of development. And now, but I suspect what happens is our life history probably evolved to be slower first. So things like sloths, for example, have a very, very slow life history, slow metabolic rate, but they don't have big brains, so sloths don't have big brains. I suspect we evolved a slow life history, and I think that then probably gave us the opportunity to invest and to develop larger brains, including larger cortexes and larger neocortices. So I suspect that would be the route that goes. And so I will go and read her paper because it sounds fascinating, but it makes really good sense.
I link it, yeah.
It makes really good sense to me because I think if we'd already got a slow life history, that then gives us the capacity to grow large brains and large neocortices.
Yeah, or neuron-rich brains.
Yeah.
So. Very interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely link that paper in the show notes, and I'll email it to you after.
Fantastic, thank you.
After the conversation, yeah. For listeners who might want to check that, I think that was episode 27. If they want to go and listen to it, and I also mentioned the episode with Ian Tattersall, that was 37. So 27 and 37, there's two episodes to go look after this. But another question I do want to ask about humans before we move on is, in your day job as a biologist, you study predation, right? And you mentioned already that one way that predation links into human story is that probably humans, more than our ancestors, kind of pre-human ancestors, had to live with the threat of predation. Being smart helps, sticking together helps, being able to throw rocks helps. There's all sorts of things that could have helped us. But another story, of course, is that humans also became predators. At least we don't know how much our common ancestor with chimpanzees. They might have hunted every once in a while. Chimpanzees do hunt every once in a while, but not to the extent that humans do. And by the way, some non-scientific paleo fantasies do sometimes overblow, I think, the role of hunting. We haven't lived from pure meat. That's pretty clear. We can't process protein like cats do. But I don't think any serious scientist would disagree with the fact that humans did become predators in a way that we did depend quite a lot on animal protein and animal fats. So with that preface, an open commentary from you. How do you, as a biologist who studies predation across species, wolves and whatnot, when you were reading through the human story, how did you see the role of humans becoming predators? What surprised you about it, or what made kind of more sense to you that it might have to someone who's not a predator expert? I would be really keen to hear your kind of open commentary on humans as predators.
So I think it's fairly clear. I mean, we're an omnivorous species. We can eat pretty much anything. There's no doubt about that. But we can digest animal protein. We do. If we don't have animal protein or eat meat or other animals, there's a real risk you start suffering from vitamin B12 deficiency. Now, interesting, gorillas, they have a vegetarian diet. They don't eat meat. And so the way they get their vitamin B12 is through coprophagy. So they eat poo. And the reason is the bacteria. Yeah.
Okay.
And you recycle it round. So there's no doubt that we are adapted to have meat in our diets. I think there have been periods, I think there were certainly some populations that probably ate more meat than others. We even see that in human societies today, and ancient human societies where vegetarianism was probably more common in parts of India and Southeast Asia than it was in places like Finland and Northern Europe. And again, part of the reason for that is, there wasn't a lot of vegetation or fruits that you could eat most of the year. So you did eat a lot of meat. And so our ancestors had been doing that. And we are adapted to be able to consume meat.
And the last hunter-gatherers of Europe, they on some islands I think it was between Denmark and Sweden. I learned from one conversation last summer that they survived the winter with oysters.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so there was a couple of months when there was basically nothing else to eat. There were only oysters, and the moment that there's climate change that takes salt levels of the Baltic Sea too low, that they switch to agriculture basically overnight.
Mike, what a diet in this day and age. The people thinking, a diet of entirely oysters would be seen as incredibly extravagant. So,
yeah.
So no, I mean, there's no doubt that we did get, we through our evolutionary history, we moved to a point, first of all, probably from scavenging carcasses. Some hunter-gatherers now still will actually steal kills from lions in Tanzania. You see that. So we probably started to scavenge, and we probably started to steal kills. And then we started to hunt. Certainly Homo erectus had the dentition for something that was eating a fairly significant amount of meat in its diet.
And is there anything that makes us a kind of weird predator from the eyes of a predator expert, or were we just another omnivorous predator doing their thing?
No, we were far from average, and the reason is we were able to use tools, and we were to be able to develop tools much faster than we could have evolved, characteristics that were, morphological characteristics. So we can create spears much faster than we could evolve large claws or something like that. And so it meant that we could win every arms race that we got involved in very quickly. And if you look, it's really interesting. If you look at, and some people don't like this argument, but for me, it's pretty compelling. If you look at the spread of humans around the world as we left Africa, 70, 75,000 years ago, went through Asia down into Australia, then made it over to the Americas 16,000 years ago, down to South America 14,000 years ago, then out into the islands of the Pacific and over to New Zealand. What about, tops 1,000 years ago in New Zealand? Every place we arrived, we killed off the large animals. It happened again and again. So about 75,000 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, there were 57 animal species that weighed over a ton living on Earth, terrestrial animal species. Obviously, whales weigh more. There are 11 alive now. It was us that drove the others extinct. They always occurred just after we arrived in places. These include giant wombats, diprotodons. They include giant monitor lizards that used to live in Australia, species of elephant relatives, things like mammoths and whatever in Asia and in Eurasia and in North America. Even in Africa, we lost an elephant species. We lost a large wildebeest cousin. We lost a giant warthog. We are, and very few other predators are able to drive their prey extinct. We are really unusual. And the reason we're unusual is because we have been able to evolve tools or to adapt tools. We have the evolutionary capacity to be able to build tools much more quickly than our prey can respond defenses, can evolve defenses. So yeah, we're far from unusual.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to start coming to an end. But I have my final question, which I always finish these episodes with, which is how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
I mean, we are a remarkable species. There's no doubt about this. We are, I think it was Carl Sagan who said, we are the universe's way of appreciating its magnificence, or words to that effect. I think, whether there's intelligent life or other planets is, something that, is an interesting thing to talk about. But as far as we're aware, we're the only, as far as, we were discovered, we're the only species that has the intelligence to understand how the universe works. And I can't believe I'm alive and a person who's alive at this time where science has made such astonishing progress. It's absolutely remarkable how physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, consciousness research has taken us on a journey of understanding how we got here. And I'm, I loved writing the book. I hope people will read it and enjoy it, because I've not only I'm now on a podcast to do when I'm talking to you about humans and where did humans come from. Last night I was talking about the role of the cosmos and the emergence of life. So, and it's just wonderful to be able to have thought about all of these things and the breakthroughs of science and try and link it together. I'm sure I've made mistakes. I'm sure I haven't got it all right, but what a privilege it is for us to be human and alive now, and to be able to think about these things, and for there to be so much knowledge to dive into. And it's been an absolute joy talking to you. Thank you very much for having me on. I've loved every minute of it.
Well, thank you so much. Pleasure has been mine, and hopefully of many, many listeners. But with those words, Professor Tim Coulson, thank you so much. So that was it. Stay tuned for episode 2 next Tuesday. Subscribe to On Humans on your podcast player and head to onhumans.substack.com/origins to get more material on the origins of humankind. Until next time, take care.